And it's great to speak in such a historic, beautiful setting. We were hearing in the taxi on the way here a little bit about the history of the park and the area, and just the history of this building and things like that. So it's really great to be here for many different reasons. Now, it's great. I've been on this crazy journey since my book came out. One thing I also wanted to say before I start is we're obviously an intimate group of friends, and so even though I'm going to be giving a lecture for an hour, if anybody at any time wants to have a conversation or interrupt me or talk about anything, just raise your hand or blurt it out or anything like that, because I'm happy to stop during the talk. But anyway, I'll be talking about my recent book, Dying of Whiteness, and it's been a pretty interesting history for me in that the book came out and I don't think people, in the beginning, me included, realized kind of what was going to happen with a book like this. It was a book that was about race and politics, and a book about what it means to be white in America. And those really aren't topics that people talk about very much. And so we really had no idea what was going to happen with this book. And even my publisher, they had a very limited run in the very beginning. They didn't publish very many books. They were just like, well, let's see what happens with this. And it turned out a couple of things happened when the book came out. First, all of a sudden, the media went crazy. I was on this show called The Morning Joe Show on MSNBC on the very first morning the book came out. And then all of a sudden I had like 50 different interviews within the next week or something. It was kind of ridiculous. And the book was all of a sudden had a 3-month wait for people to get the book. So that was like the first phase. And then the second phase was that I was giving a talk in Washington about a month after the book came out as part of a book festival. And Nazis actually came and stormed the talk that I was giving and took over the whole thing. They came with bullhorns and things like that. And they were protesting about me co-opting the narrative of whiteness and America is for white people and all these kind of things. And for a minute, it was scary. Like many people here, I have a family history with Nazis, which is not incredibly happy one. And you know, just the thought that Nazis would come back in my life was kind of crazy. But it turned out there was somebody who was a videographer in the audience, and she took a video of what was happening, and it went on every news channel. And all of a sudden, the book went to #9 on Amazon, and it was another whole thing. And so all my friends now, they're saying, how can we get some Nazis for our book talk? Because the Nazis are they're like the best. They're better than like an advertisement or something like that. So it's been an interesting trajectory. And the question I'll start with is just, what's the central question and how does this link to my work? Now, I've given talks here before about earlier work that I've done, and so people who've heard me speak here before know that I work on questions of race and politics and health. My last book was a book called The Protest Psychosis that looked at the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in black men and how that history linked to the history of civil rights in America and other factors. And what I found was that this overdiagnosis was linked to a lot of political imagery that had to do with black power and civil rights and factors like that. I've also been doing a big project on mass shootings and guns and mental illness. And it turned out this story about mental illness and guns also had a very particular history that linked health, obviously, and guns and race, because mental illness and guns have this long racial history. And so that led me to this project. It's interesting for me because in thinking about how the genesis of this project, which is what I'm going to start my talk, talking about how I came to a project about whiteness, part of it is that I'm somebody who grew up in a state called Missouri in the United States that had a pretty centrist history, right? Missouri was what is called a purple state. There were people who were conservative, people who were liberal, people who were pro-gun, anti-gun, pro and anti-everything you can think of. And, we seem to get along reasonably well. I mean, there were obviously tensions about race and about politics, but the Missouri that I grew up in was a place where there was a range of political opinions. And even in the state Senate, for example, there was a kind of famous example where Democrats and Republicans were pretty close in terms of their number of votes. And so they devised a power sharing agreement where every month they would shift the power of the committees and stuff like that because they thought, let's represent everybody. And that happened for a long time. And then what happened was about 2008, there was a move in Missouri and many states like it that were tremendously disrespectful to that story. All of a sudden, people were saying, the government is out to get you. It was a very racial story. It was based in pro-gun, anti-immigrant, anti-government kind of story. And it really took over the state. And the things that people were protesting were things that seem crazy, right? They were protesting against their health care. They were protesting for guns, all these kind of things. And so partially the story for me came from having lived in a state that was a very centrist state that became a very conservative state, which is what's happened in many Midwestern and Southern states. And it links to, I think, the question that I want to bring the talk with, which is that from an outside perspective, it really did feel like people were advocating positions that were bad for them, right? All of a sudden, when the Tea Party took over Missouri and NRA and things, people were saying, more people should have guns, and we don't want government health care and all these kind of things. So it seemed from the outside that they were advocating for positions that were not in their own self-interest. Now, I just, as a framework, right, that question of people not advocating for politics that are not in their own self-interest is one that I started looking at in 2010. But of course, it's not just an American story right now. I was just in the UK last week, and we had these conversations about what are the material effects of Brexit and who's going to gain, who's going to lose from Brexit, and what do people think in terms of their own self-interest. So there's a Brexit story, and often the Brexit story is it's going to be bad for people in this way, but good for people in a different way. And I've also heard that in terms of Trumpism versus Bibiism, right, and that kind of thing about what is the impact of the particular policies. Thank you so much. Okay, can I have a martini?
I'm not sure it's legal to put it here.
לא.
איפה?
יש מקום פה. הזמנתי בירה בעצם. So anyway, so that it's also the story often that you hear in Israel about why are people going to support politicians that are not going to help them in terms of their policies. And what's interesting, I think, about the United States in that regard is that I've learned a lot about this story, about voting against your own self-interest. And part of the story that I'm going to tell you tonight is, on one hand, people are voting against their own self-interest. But the other part of the story is that they had different interests than I did, right? Their narrative was one not so much about health or public health. They were actually very skeptical of public health, but their story was one about immigrants taking over the country and I only vote for abortion and all these kind of things. Like, they had their own story. Now, I didn't agree with the story, but it wasn't like I could impose my interests on their interests. So that's part of it. And the other thing is that, as you'll see in a minute here, that it also had a lot to do with race. That the reason that people were voting against their interest wasn't just because of particular ideology. It had to do with race and racial tensions. Let me give you an example of that. When I moved from Michigan, one of my former colleagues and friends is here, to Tennessee, and I moved to Tennessee in the year 2011. And in the year 2011, it was important because there was this big debate in Tennessee where I was moving to about this thing called the Affordable Care Act, which was a big piece of legislation that was passed after Obama became president and after the Democrats took over the Congress and the Senate for 2 years before. I won't even get to that. But this Affordable Care Act was very interesting in relation to the United States, but it was particularly important in relation to the state of Tennessee. Now, why was it important in relation to the state of Tennessee? There are a couple of reasons. One is that there's a long history of trying to do what the Affordable Care Act did. In Tennessee. Tennessee is a state that has had very bad health outcomes for a long time. And it's also a state that has tried to do innovative programs to get people health insurance. I think the most important one, can people see the slides okay? Was a program called TennCare from the 1990s. And TennCare was a program that basically was the invention of a Republican governor of the state of Tennessee. And he basically said, how can we get people insured? Well, we want to do a new program that combines government with private health insurance. And we want to create some mix of public and private and see what we can do. And so they started this massive new program called TennCare. And you can see in the very bottom, it gained a lot of national attention. But in the first couple of years of TennCare, when they started to basically, their goal was to insure the entire state. And in the mid-1990s, a state of Tennessee, which had had terrible health outcomes, rose to insure 94% of its population. So this was this remarkable success story for about 5, 6, or 7 years. And then what happened was first, a lot of other southern states started to say, gosh, if Tennessee can insure its people, we can do health insurance also. This is amazing. This is a great success story. So that was the first phase. But unfortunately, what happens when you try to give health insurance to a community of people who had never had health insurance before, and all of a sudden you have 94% of the people that have health insurance, what happens is people come into the doctor with very expensive problems because they've been sitting at home with cardiovascular disease or kidney or liver disease for 30 years. So it's not like, I need a physical for my high school soccer team or something like that. It's like, gosh, my liver's 6 times as large. What do I do about this? So every person who came in was very expensive. And what happened was they just didn't have enough money to support this program. And so the program started to fail. It started to falter because of lack of funds. And soon they had to close clinics. They had to close hospitals. And here's an article from the New York Times that talked about how they actually had to kick people off the rolls in Tennessee, and the people who still were on TennCare, they'd have to take off a week of their work and call and call and call repeatedly just to get through to an operator because they couldn't even answer the phone. So here's Tennessee, a state that had the goal of insuring all of its people, and then they couldn't do it because of cost. So that's one thing that's important about Tennessee. A second thing that's important about Tennessee is, I'll use a medical word, we have really crap health outcomes, right? If you look at pretty much any health indicator in our state, obesity rates, heroin overdose, chronic disease, infant mortality, all of these things are worse in Tennessee than they are in the entire country. We're in the lower 40s about many of these factors, and we also have very high rates of uninsurance, and particularly skyrocketing rates of uninsurance around the time that Obamacare came into being in 2010. And people really saw this particular dynamic as a crisis, right? All these things were happening. There was bad health, there was no insurance, and also there was bad public health, bad preventative health. And so there was a lot of obesity, there was a lot of smoking, all these factors. And this is all happening in 2010, 2011. And what happens? Here comes this thing called the Affordable Care Act. Now, I realize the Affordable Care Act was not a perfect piece of legislation. It was like your first iPhone or your first video game or something. It was something that was a starter that would be improved over time. But let's just look at what the Affordable Care Act was trying to do in Tennessee and in the country. Well, the Affordable Care Act, it gave free preventative care. And that's important because people aren't then going to get sick like they were in Tennessee. They're not going to get sick and stay at home. Instead, they're going to have preventative care, which will stop this downward issue of illness. There's going to be prevention and public health. So it's not just investing in the medical clinic, but it's also helping things like anti-smoking campaigns, anti-obesity campaigns. Again, a huge issue for Tennessee. It's also providing new consumer protections. Now that's important because, as I mentioned, toward the end of TennCare, people were getting thrown off the rolls, people who were actually quite sick, and so that wouldn't be able to happen anymore because there was this new program that was going to give people a certain kind of protection. And it was also making sure that there was a safety net so that low-income people and families would have insurance. And so just think about it. Here's a state Here's a state that has all of these terrible health problems, and then here's a program like the Affordable Care Act, which comes along and addresses exactly the medical problems that people have. And so in an ideal world, you could think that the Affordable Care Act for Tennessee was manna from heaven, right? Because it was an answer to exactly the health crisis that people had. And the other issue was 70%, 80% of the funding was coming from the federal government. So they would also get money to pay for all of these programs. Now, that might be in an ideal world, in a perfect world, what happened. Unfortunately, in the world of the United States, that's not what happened. What happened was when they introduced the Affordable Care Act to Tennessee, people started to protest. There were protests that said, Obama, get your hands off my health care, as if they had health care, which they didn't. So factors like that. And then you can see over there, there were also a lot of racial tensions with Obama himself, who was depicted as an African witch doctor and other things like that. And so here's this issue about this healthcare program and people rejecting it. And while this is happening, a colleague of mine and I started a research project. What we did is we went to low-income housing communities around Nashville and in rural Tennessee, and we talked to chronically ill men who were very poor, very often, black men and white men, and we just wanted to ask them, how do you feel about the Affordable Care Act? Now, the idea here was, you might be a Republican, you might be a Democrat, but if you're sick and you need medical care, it doesn't matter, you're going to want the medical care. That was kind of our idea. So we thought that people who were poor and who were medically ill would be the exact people who might support the Affordable Care Act despite their ideology. Unfortunately, that wasn't exactly what we found. What we found were dramatic differences, and really the differences broke down depending on the race of who we spoke to. So first, let me just say a couple things before I get to the race, that these aren't the pictures exactly of the men we were talking to, but these are stock photos, but these are the kind of men that we were talking to, people who were down on their luck, who were a bit desperate. And I think, first of all, one of the first most important things to recognize is that we heard a lot of stories of people just being incredibly brave, incredibly and powerfully brave. And part of that is that in a country like the United States, if you're poor and you don't have health care, you can just fall all the way through the system. There's not, like in Israel, a safety net. There's nothing to catch you. And so part of the stories we heard were just what it means to stay alive. And people were incredibly brave, incredibly powerful. But there were also these profound racial differences in what we heard. And so let me just tell you a little bit. We started these focus groups with men, and we would start the focus groups by basically asking questions. We would say, what do you do to stay healthy? What does health mean to you? What kind of health practices that you do? And in those groups, all the groups of men pretty much sounded the same when we did that. For the first 15 or 20 minutes, that was the conversation. Black men, white men, they would all say things like, gosh, I try to exercise, but it's really hard. Or, gosh, I know I shouldn't go to McDonald's, but the Big Mac is on sale, or whatever, that kind of thing. So they all tried to stay healthy. It was very common. But then about 15 minutes into the group, we would ask a question, which was, okay, we have this new thing called the Affordable Care Act. And the question we asked is, who benefits from healthcare reform? It was a complicated question on purpose. And it was complicated because we didn't ask, do you have healthcare reform? How do you feel about it? It was more, what's your sense of the bigger value of having insurance? Now, here's a set of answers that we have from African American men. And this is very representative of the kind of answers that we got from black men. I think society does. And that it keeps people having insurance. It keeps the cost down for everyone. Yeah, because people are healthy and checkups like that. I think everyone, as a society, we all benefit from having people insured. Someone has to protect the citizenship, not just black people, but protect us as a country, And so these are important issues, right? Because what these black men are saying is it's not just about us as black men. It's about us as a society. And that's the attitude that you really want somebody to have in relation to health insurance, right? Because health insurance works when the most people buy into it, when a society invests in it. So that was what black men said. We got a very different story when we talked to white men, and we would ask that same question: who benefits from healthcare reform? When we asked that question, it was very silent for about a minute in the room. All of a sudden, everybody who'd been joking around stopped telling jokes. And then they said stuff like this: I'm 53, I've had 2 heart attacks, I have a chronic cough, my diet sucks, I'm fat, I smoke, I work 12 hours a day flipping burgers, then I come back to my room, eat junk food, watch TV, and fall asleep. I'm a ticking time bomb health-wise, I've got high blood pressure, and I'm gonna die when I'm young, just like my dad. And then I'd say, well, so how about Obamacare, Affordable Care Act? That could sure help you, right? And he'd say, I ain't supporting Obamacare, no way. And I ain't signing up for it neither. I'm rejecting healthcare, right? And I'd say, well, why are you rejecting your own healthcare? And he said, ain't no way I want my tax dollars helping Mexicans or welfare queens. So I'm not gonna support a program that's gonna help other people. And this kind of answer came up again and again and again. Here's a few other examples. A lot of those other people use Obamacare. They're not sick. They go to 2 or 3 doctors and they use the shit out of it. And somebody really needs to tell them it ain't just there for you to get. There's a lot of people that use welfare and need to get a job, quit having children, and get really buckled down. People are having 10 and 12 kids. They're using it up. It's about time somebody did something about it. And one of my favorite quotes: the worst thing about Obamacare, what really pisses Americans off, is that we are pocketing all the Mexicans, all the illegal mother truckers, their houses, their cars, their food stamps, everything they want, we're paying for it. And this was a very common kind of answer that we got in poor men, but think about how powerful this moment is. Here are men who are literally dying, literally dying. Men would come with oxygen tanks, or 40-year-old men with walkers because their liver was so inflamed, and things like that. So these are guys who needed health care, and over the course of many of our interviews, a number of the people actually passed away. So this was happening at that time, and yet what happens is, instead of saying we need the health care, they presented what's called a zero-sum formulation of race, that there are winners and losers, and those people who are taking our resources are taken away. So that became the existential question that I ask in the book, which is really, what were these men dying of? What was causing their mortality? And I really look at 2 different kinds of answers. On one hand, I think it's important to note, and it was hard to miss going through these issues, that men were dying of real medical illness. Every kind of chronic illness you can think of: heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, addiction, deaths of despair. And so part of it was a story about biology. It was a story about what it means to be poor in the United States, and what happens to you when you don't have health care. You die young, flat out. But on the other hand, there was a story about ideology, right? That these men were also dying because of their ideology. They were dying because they believed that there were privileges that were due to white Americans, that there were minorities who were usurping their privilege and their money, and that we white Americans are paying for you black and brown people. Now, on one hand, you could think, well, that's not very surprising. I went to a state with a long history of racism, and people said racist things when I interviewed them. But what's important is it wasn't just these men who were saying the racist stuff. In fact, this idea of blocking healthcare, blocking Obamacare, because the money would go to Mexicans and welfare queens and other people, was a story that became the statewide story. And why do I say it became the statewide story? Because when it came to a vote, people in Tennessee actually elected politicians whose main platform was, we're going to block Obamacare, and we're going to block the expansion of Medicaid in your state. And so the story that these men were telling us also became a statewide story, because Tennessee literally blocked Obamacare. It blocked the expansion of healthcare in its own state, and people voted for it. Another part of that story is that pretty much every southern state did the same thing. Pretty much every southern state in the country voted to not have its own health care, to block expansion, to not have a safety net. But there was one state that didn't do that. The state that didn't do that for a period of 4 years was Kentucky. here's a map of Tennessee and Kentucky, and you can see that we're up and down neighbors, like a duplex, right? So Kentucky is right on top of us, and Tennessee is at the bottom. So we're right next to each other, and the states are very similar in terms of demographics, in terms of politics, economics, factors like that. And so for me, this was a pretty interesting point of comparison, right? Because all of a sudden, here are two states, Tennessee that blocked the Affordable Care Act, and Kentucky right next door that accepted the Affordable Care Act. And so I started to do some comparison data analysis just about what happened to people's rates of insurance and health between Kentucky and Tennessee. And I just want to tell you two things about the data that I found. Number one is that if you're a racist, denying health care for people is very effective. It's a very effective way to be a structural racist. And I say that just looking at the rates of health insurance, for example. The graph over there was rates of uninsured Hispanic, Latino people. And you can see that that top dotted graph is Tennessee. So Latino people stayed uninsured in Tennessee. The rate went down just a little bit with the advent of Obamacare. But the bottom graph, the solid line, is Kentucky, where all of a sudden the rate of uninsured Latino people went down dramatically. Latino people started to get health insurance. So if you wanted Latino people to not have health insurance, blocking the Affordable Care Act was very effective. The same thing for African Americans. You can see the dotted line. Tennessee, there remained very high rates of uninsurance for black people. But in Kentucky, look at that line. All of a sudden, dramatic drops from almost 30% to 7% of uninsurance. So black and brown people got coverage on health insurance. Now, so again, if you want to be racist, it's great. I mean, that's what Trump is actually doing right now in the United States, blocking the Affordable Care Act. The only problem with doing it that way is that if you block health insurance for black and brown people, you also block health insurance for white people. And so because both of these states are 85% white, the worst health outcomes are actually going to come if you look at what happened to white populations. And that's what I did for the other part of the data story. So this is a graph, for example, about percentage of adults without a routine doctor's visit in the last year. And it turned out, these numbers are for white people. White people stopped going to the doctor for routine office visits because they couldn't afford it, whereas in Kentucky, white people went to the doctor more. This is about adults who would forego medical care because they didn't have insurance. And it turned out also many people in Tennessee were foregoing medical care, again, because they were worried about it. But Kentucky was this amazing success story because what happened in Kentucky is because people had health insurance, not only did they go to the doctor when they were sick and for routine visits, but also they got better financially over the 4 years of the study. There were fewer medical bankruptcies. Their prescription medications became less effective. So here's an example of next-door neighbor states where you can just look next door and see what happens. And when I added all of this up, it turned out that the entire healthcare system started to fail in Tennessee, and the biggest loss of life was among white people, right? All of a sudden, white people started to not go to the doctor, factors like that. And so it's a long data story that I tell in the book, but basically in the data part, I show how rejecting the Affordable Care Act and this idea that they were doing it to hurt black people ended up killing white people about a month sooner. Every white person on an aggregate level lost about three weeks of life. And so it was a trade-off, right? And that became a jumping off point for me in this project. It was really a story about what other examples are there in which this idea of what it means to be white, blocking immigrants, blocking black people, or white superiority or things like that. Where in other places is it a trade-off where you're actually trading your own health? That's why the book is called Dying of Whiteness, because the story really was about the kind of trade-offs that people make to assume this position of what it means to be white. And I have 3 different stories that I tell in the book. I tell a story about guns in Missouri. I'm going to give you some examples here in a moment, where people carried guns because they felt like it was part of their white identity, but it turned out that the guns were much more lethal to them than they were to the people they were trying to protect themselves from. Healthcare was a big part of the story. And then another part of the story was about education. So I went to Kansas, where people were supporting tax cuts. And these tax cuts ended up affecting the schools that their own children went to because they were worried that black people were taking money from the school system. So here were three different examples. And really, the issue wasn't so much that every person is a racist. Many people I talked to didn't say crazy things about Mexicans or black people. Many people were just trying to live their lives. So the story's not really about individual racism. It's really a story about health policy and what happens when you elect politicians whose main goal is cutting government programs that could benefit everyone, but the fantasy is you're going to hurt these minorities who are taking away resources. So that's the main story. Let me give you two quick examples before I finish. Please.
You understand what you're... but at one point you said that you and a colleague went and spoke or did research with poor white people.
Yeah.
And you say that the poor white people didn't want the white money to be spent on black, but it doesn't make sense to me because why wouldn't, I don't know what the questions were, but why wouldn't they say that they're very upset that rich people or
well, that's
social,
the story of the book.
High
Yeah.
social economic status of white people is not going to them.
You know, that's one of the main stories of the entire book. Every example that I'm going to show you some more examples of that. I had the exact same question in my mind. Donnie wants to give you that. But I had the same question in my mind, and part of what I argue is that it's a form of manipulation, and I'll say that a little bit more in the end, where they tell people that in order to be white, you have to be pro-gun, anti-Obamacare, anti-education. So in a way, the Republican Party has been very successful at crafting this narrative, and it's also a financial story, right? Because imagine if every poor white person said, I'm a Republican, but I want good health care, I want good schools, you know, I want a safe community. All of a sudden, the Republican Party would have to pay money to support poor people, and they wouldn't have money to give tax cuts to rich people. And so the whole Republican platform depends on people. That's why I said about going against their own self-interest. And it was, even for these healthcare focus groups, you know, it was so, for me personally, frustrating, right? Because here are people who are, if here's society, these people are about here, and they were all looking down. They were saying, well, I might not be at the top of the pyramid, but I'm not at the bottom. People at the bottom are Mexicans and welfare queens, and I sure don't want to be down there. So they were all worried about immigrants coming across the border, taking our resources, and I just wanted to scream when I was doing the research because I said, you should be looking up, actually. The people who are really screwing you over are the people up here, but I think the narrative has been so effective at not getting people to look up. So I think that's part of the central story here. Now, the other part I want to say about that is that we did focus groups. I don't mention it in this talk, but we did focus groups with middle income and wealthy white people also. And what was interesting was they also said Mexicans and welfare queens are usurping the system. So the other interesting part was wealthy people were tying on to this narrative as well. So, you know, there's all these interesting things about class, but I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that's the brilliance, the evil brilliance of this particular form of politics right now, is you get people to blame other people all the time, and it distracts them from actually seeing who's creating the material conditions, you know. I mean, the people in Tennessee, they were complaining that they didn't have health care, and that minorities were usurping all the resources, but the people who were really usurping the resources were the wealthy people who were getting all these tax cuts, right? So there's this logical disconnect, you know, that really needs to happen for this politics. I'll give a couple other examples about Missouri, and then I'll say a few words about Kansas, and then I'll be very cheerful and tell you that we're going to fix this by joining all together and kumbaya. But I will say, I was telling you about Missouri. Missouri was a state, and when I grew up in Missouri, Missouri was a state where it was very hard to get a gun. When I grew up, you know, there's a long hunting tradition. Many people hunt. Many people do other things. what happened was when the National Rifle Association and its politicians started to take over the state legislature, they basically eliminated all the gun laws, right? All the laws that made it harder for somebody to get a gun, and it became incredibly easy. I mean, almost embarrassingly easy to get a gun in Missouri. So they started saying, you shouldn't have to have a permit. You shouldn't have to take a test. You shouldn't have to do any training. The law for carrying a gun used to be 21. They said 18-year-olds should carry guns. They passed all these crazy things like campus carry. So in Missouri, for example, in the university, the students and the professors can carry guns in the classroom. The positive thing here I tell my colleagues is this is the end of the grade inflation debate, because if your student got an A- and they come in with a gun, and for me it's like A+, no problem. That's, everybody gets an A+. But it got to be almost embarrassing, all the places where you could carry a gun. Now, what happened when it became easier to get a gun? Well, one of the things that happened is white people rushed out and bought about 85% of the guns in the state. There was a dramatic rise in white gun ownership in Missouri. And the reason was because particularly middle-aged white men started to run to gun shows and become what are called gun super owners. A gun super owner is somebody who owns more than 27 assault rifles, and they would build arsenals in their homes. So all of a sudden, all the guns were going to mostly middle-aged white men who were building, military outposts in their basements or under their beds or things like that. So partially, there was a big push about gun ownership in Missouri. Now, I was talking about race before. Why is that important? And part of the reason that's important is because that's not a new thing. In a state like Missouri, there's a very long history of white people being able to own guns. And in fact, during the Civil War, during the Revolutionary War, it was basically white Americans who had the right to carry guns, but black people could not carry guns in public. And so part of what it meant to carry a gun was a sign of white privilege. And why was that? It was because they wanted to be able to suppress slaves that ran away, slave revolts, and things like that. So part of the issue is that guns have been linked to white authority in Missouri for a very long time. And every time black people would try to get guns, politically, by saying, oh, we have the same rights to get guns, there would be a big push to basically say, no, you can't get guns. And I found that in Missouri. A couple things were happening in Missouri when I went to do my research there. One was that there were all these ads everywhere I went for the National Rifle Association that were basically telling white people that it's your power to have a gun, that if you want white authority, if you want white privilege and things like that, that what you need to do. And so the gun ads, for example, that I saw when I was in Missouri talked about the armed citizen, right? That's a coded way to say you're protecting yourself against immigrants, illegal immigrants. You can't see it here, but it says restore the balance of power. So if black and brown people have come, you can get a gun and restore the balance of power. And so these were very powerful messages. And when I was doing my research in Missouri, I would go around with people who were called open carry advocates, and they would say the same thing. We're restoring the balance of power. We're citizens. This is our right to have guns. And this is a picture that I took of a march where basically they marched through the streets of St. Louis, walking through black areas, white people with guns, walking through black areas, holding up their weapons. So there was this whole racial politics of who got to carry a gun in Missouri. And the other side of that is that when black people would try to march with open guns and things like that, they would often get arrested. I went to a place, a very southern place in Missouri called Cape Girardeau. And this is a very pro-gun area, a very southern area. And I asked people, why is it that you carry guns? And they would say, it's about patriotism. It's about liberty, freedom, power, privilege. And so it was a very political story. Now, I just want to make 2 points about what happens when you let a lot of guns into a society, because I think it's important also in the thinking about the Israeli context. In the Israeli context, people get guns often through the military. They have particular training. Sometimes they get the gun, actually literally from the state. And in the Israeli context, very often, people, if you ask them, this is a hypothesis that we're going to test, why do you have a gun? People will say, I'm defending my nation. I'm defending against invasion or terrorism or something like that. But in the United States, that's not the story that people tell about guns. They say, it's my personal individual liberty, it's my personal right. And when I would ask people, how are you protecting yourself why do you need a gun? People would say, because a black person could break into my home and steal my television, or could carjack me, or something like that. And so it's a very individual story in the United States. I think it's a profound difference that we might want to talk about in the Q&A afterwards. Now, there are two things that happens when you flood a lot of guns into society. Number one is, this is a mess, this slide, but basically what happened in Missouri is you just have rising rates of homicide. And that's what gets all the media, that's what gets all the attention. All of a sudden, rates of homicide go up, not dramatically, but considerably. And so Missouri all of a sudden went to 5th in the nation in terms of homicide. So I would acknowledge that that was happening. And the main people who died from homicides were people of color in inner cities. But there's another story. And the other story is, we have 40,000 gun deaths a year in the United States, 40,000, civilian. And of those 40,000 gun deaths, what do you think the leading cause of gun death is? Anybody? Suicide, exactly. So 2/3 of gun death are suicide. It's this remarkable story that never makes it into the news. And so I started looking at what happened to Missouri when they made it easier for guns. Now here's a graph from data that I pulled from the CDC database. And the bottom two states are states where it continued to be hard to get a gun, New York and Connecticut. And you can see that their rates of gun suicide for the general population were about between 2.5, something like that. The top states are the states where it gets to be the easiest to get a gun. And the very top there, starting in 2008 when they liberalized the gun laws, is Missouri. Missouri became the gun suicide capital, really, of the United States. Gun suicide skyrocketed. And who are the people who are mostly dying of gun suicide? Well, it turns out to be the same people who own the most guns, because owning a gun is a risk factor for suicide. And so when I broke down the data, what I found was that of all of these gun suicides, 90% were white men who were dying from this factor. And so here's another place I think we can see where the idea of white, we can call it white privilege or something like that, what it means to be white, this identity of having a gun. On one hand, it gave people liberty to carry their guns, but it was also something that was shortening the lifespans of white people. And it was also interesting because I did another data analysis where I compared white men with all other groups of men in Missouri, because anybody could buy a gun, ostensibly, right? And the bottom graph is an aggregate of African American men, Latino men, Indian men, every other kind of man in Missouri. And their rates of gun suicide stayed quite low, whereas the white men were really driving all of the data. I mean, there's just really no other way to say it. White men were driving gun sales, and they were driving gun data. So here's a place where the power and privilege and authority that's given to white men also becomes a place where it's shortening the lifespans of white men. And I do all this fancy schmancy data. Not me, I have a team of people who do this. And we just started adding it up. We started adding up what was the cost of all of this loss of life. And we looked between 2008 and 2015, and we used the metric of quality of life years, and we just added up how many white life years were lost. And you can see in this top that what we found was just in this one period, it went hand in hand with the loss of over 10,500 years of white male life between 2008 and 2015. And then we break that down by dollars and other factors like that. So it's actually a public health emergency, in a way, that's being created by this idea of what it means to be white. And again, here's a place, I told you in Tennessee what happened when people got bad health care. They elected politicians who were going to keep them from having bad health care. In Missouri, all these terrible problems that people were having with guns, Missouri became a national model now for the policies that the Trump administration is trying to bring to the Supreme Court for the entire country. And so it wasn't like, oh my God, can we learn from Missouri? It was Missouri became this terrifying national model. Very quickly, I'll just tell you a kind of similar story about Kansas and education. Kansas had a very long history of excellent, excellent education, public education. And then they elected a governor named Sam Brownback. And what Governor Brownback did was he did massive tax cuts for rich people. And he paid for it by taking money away from the state's excellent public school system. And I asked people, God, why are you supporting these tax cuts like your own kids go to these schools? And some people were mortified. Some people were like, this is not who we are. We have to fight back. There was a powerful pushback. But the people who supported it would very often tell me, well, I know it's painful for my children, but black school districts are taking all the tax money and wasting it and things like that. So it was a similar story to healthcare. What I did was I just did more data analysis. It turns out taking money away from the education system really is bad for black and brown students and children. That first graph over there is what happened to African American fourth grade children's test scores on national reading exams when they started cutting away the schools. And you can see a dramatic drop in African American school student success. This is for Latino students. And again, if you want to be a racist, cutting away money from education is a great way to be a racist, because look at this. All of a sudden, black students in fourth grade saw dramatic drops in reading and science scores on their exams. But who do you think had the worst outcomes of any students across the state? You got it. White students. White students, it turns out Kansas is 85% white, and the worst outcomes were seen in dramatic drops in white fourth grade and eighth grade reading and science scores. So white people were actually suffering the worst consequences by a long shot. They were seeing worse fourth and eighth grade outcomes, and they were also seeing the worst high school dropout rates, dramatic rises in high school dropout rates. So once they started cutting these schools, it turned out white students started dropping out of high school more than anybody else. Now again, I used quality of life year data. And there's a lot of research that suggests that dropping out of high school will shorten your lifespan by 5 to 7 years. So I just use that data because, you have a worse job, less access to health care, you might, smoke or, more likely things like that. And so I just took that data and I applied it to Kansas, and I said, what's the effect of just 2 or 3 years of cuts? And it turned out that when they started cutting education between 2012 and 2016, it went hand in hand with a loss of almost 7,000 white life years. So again, here's a place where these tax cuts that are supposed to be targeting black people end up killing white people also. So that's the story really of the book. And of course, Kansas should be a national model for what we don't do. We should say like, oh my God, students are doing terrible in Kansas, let's not do that. But unfortunately, the people who have been hired by the Trump administration are trying to take the example of Kansas and make it the education policy for the entire United States. That's what Betsy DeVos is doing. So here are these regional stories. And if we lived in a normal universe, they would be cautionary tales, Holy shit, there's all this bad stuff happening in these states. So let's take what's happening in the good states where things are doing well, and let's do that and adopt that. But instead, we're doing exactly the opposite. What we're doing is we're nationalizing these particular stories. And what we're doing is we're creating national policies. Now, I'm going to finish up in a minute here. But let me just say, I'm using a public health lens, right? I'm looking at these politics, and I'm using numbers like quality of life years and lost life years and health indicators, health outcomes. And I just want to be clear that that's not the metric that many people I spoke to would use. They were very suspect of public health. They were very suspect of data. And they also said, maybe that's a trade-off I'm willing to make, because I would tell them, well, you're blocking your own health care and it's going to cost you about a month of your life. How do you feel about that? And they would say, well, if Trump puts in judges who block abortion or builds a wall that stops immigrants coming, that's a trade-off I'm willing to make. And so they felt like they were on this winning side. And, there's a history of that kind of trade-off that people make, kamikazes or martyrs, dying in the name of a larger cause. And I think a lot of people, for them, that's kind of what they saw. And that trade-off, as the question suggested, that trade-off of not seeing the effect on yourself, and really not seeing that all the money was going to rich people, which is really what was happening, was central to the success of the GOP. And it was tied to this ideology, an ideology that I think the Democrats missed. But I think the take-home point of the book is that from the perspective of health and longevity, really what these policies were doing across the board was creating risk factors that were as dangerous to people as secondhand smoke, or not wearing a seatbelt in cars, or asbestos. They were really creating man-made risk factors, and ultimately what happened was, because of these risk factors, they were making what it means to be white in America, whiteness itself became a high-risk category. So people were voting, literally, for their own demise. It's a crazy story. And as I mentioned, instead of saying, we need to do something about it, this story became national. Let me say a few things before we argue about this. And so I think the first lesson that we can see here, which I think is a broader lesson for Israel and for the rest of the world, is that, and certainly for UK where I just was, is that there's a fantasy that you can create a system in which you're not gonna, it's just gonna benefit your group and screw over the other groups. In other words, the people I spoke with, it's not like they were against healthcare. Many of them were using the healthcare system. They just thought that a national healthcare system was not going to be in their interest because it was helping black people also. And I think what the data that I'm showing you says is that's a fantasy that people might have about national systems, but it turns out we're all connected. And so if you take money away from the system, basically we either rise together or we fall together, and especially in relation to government programs. And it really is a fantasy that you can hurt some group you don't care about and help your own group. And I show a lot of data toward the end of the book that talks about how data on more horizontal societies that try to rise everybody up end up doing much better on these particular health outcomes for that very reason. And I, of course, get many threats in the United States. I got one in the car on the way over here, a very anti-Semitic message, which I get all the time. And they tell me all these things about, first they say, you Jew, and then they say, there's plenty of suicide in other parts of the world, or, there's blah, 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 all these rationalizations. And I keep telling them, you can make a critique of me. I'm happy to engage with critique. But if you want to really engage my argument, your critique should be that your politics make people healthier. Because I'm saying they make people unhealthier. So a real critique wouldn't be comparing us to Japan or something. I mean, actually, we would lose that. But it's more like, tell me how having more guns makes people healthier. Or tell me how cutting the healthcare system makes people healthier. So I feel like that would be a fair critique, but I have not gotten that critique quite yet. Another important part of this story is that it shows the trade-offs that people make to support politicians who say that they have their best interests in mind, but often don't. Now, we often hear this story in terms of finance. And very often in the United States, we'll hear that poor people are voting against their own economic interests because they're losing all this money because of tariffs, because of money going to rich people. But what I've tried to show you tonight is that it's also a story about biology, that people are also voting against their own biological self-interest as well. Several more quick points. I also get asked a lot, well, when are people going to wake up? When are Trump voters going to wake up and realize this is not in their interests? And I think it's important to note that they really don't see it that way, in a certain kind of way. As I mentioned before, it's very tied to ideology. And so I can go down there and yell as much as I want about healthcare and healthcare reform and things like that. But I think for me, what I started thinking is, until they I mean, Trump supporters start to become the ones who demand better health care and better safety and better schools, it has to come from them. It can't really come from me. And so I don't think there's going to be a kind of wake-up narrative. But the important point is it's not linked to education. It's not like they're hillbillies who are just stupid and they don't know anything, because actually many of the people I interviewed knew more about the Affordable Care Act than my friends in New York who were on the Affordable Care Act. So it's not a story about education, really. It's a story about race and a story about ideology, and really a story about whiteness. It's also not, of course, just a story about Republicans. There are many times in which, I've started thinking in my own life, I very often do things that are not good for my health. I ride my bicycle without a helmet very often. I mean, I use Rogaine, which I find protective, possibly. Sorry, that was a bad joke. And there are many different times, entire systems like the frequent flyer mile system that are based on this illusion that you have some kind of privilege, that all of a sudden you need an upgrade on an airplane. And so, it's just an extension of that, I think. I also think it's important to note, as I was saying in answer to the question before, that the GOP has been very successful in casting particular political positions as identities. So telling people, you don't just need a gun to be healthy. Having a gun is central to what it means to be white. This is a Christmas card. I don't know if you can see it. It's kind of blurry here. But one of my respondents gave it to me. And it's a family around a Christmas tree, and they each have an AR-15 rifle. And so it's stuff like that. It was part of their identity. And so when a Democrat goes down and says, we need more gun control, it's not just a story about health. It's a story about this particular form of identity, and people are very loath to give that up. Two other quick points. I also think it's important for messaging. Now the Democrats in the United States are saying health care for everybody. And I think unless they address the issue of race, which is so central to the research I'm doing on healthcare, this is going to fail as well, because people in the South are just going to hear this as more money going to black people or Obamacare for all or something like that. And so I think it's important for Democrats in their messaging not so much to be racist, but to recognize that they're stepping into things that have long historical traditions. And ultimately, I really feel like we need to get better at talking across these divides. How do we talk across divides? And I think it's an existential question really for the United States. I think on one hand, we need that. We need to be able to learn skills. Or, as this is a tweet from Representative Steve King, a very racist senator from Iowa, he's saying we should just restart the Civil War because the South has many more guns. So either we're going to learn how to talk across our differences, or this kind of crazy stuff is going to happen. Thank you.